Hello, everyone. Welcome back to A New Crusade. Today I'm going to be talking with Aarvoll. Aarvoll, would you like to introduce yourself to everyone?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it. Yeah, the Return to the Land Private Membership Association is not exactly the community itself. It is an umbrella association intended to facilitate people forming intentional communities on the basis of shared ethnic heritage and traditional values. And there's one project right now getting started in Appalachia. There's one in the Pacific Northwest. And actually, we're looking to start our second community here in Arkansas. So currently, we have one 150-acre piece of land. We call it Community One. And yeah, it's been going pretty well. We've been at it for like a year and a half.
Got it. I had seen a little bit back. So I've been going really far back onto your channel over time. Like, I didn't discover a lot of your content until last year or the year before. And so I've been listening to a lot of your religion stuff, a lot of your philosophy stuff. But one of the things that really captured me, besides the Platonism stuff that you do, which I think is very unique to you, I think is the community, and that was one thing that really stood out to me. I'm curious. So you're the president, but are you the principal founder of the organization?
I mean, not exactly. There were about a dozen of us initially who got together to buy the land that we ended up buying, and the details of the PMA sort of emerged while we were in the land uh, search process.
Hmm.
So there was kind of a 1.0 or a alpha version of this before we even considered a private association structure, LLC structure, and I could explain exactly technically how it works and why we settled on it. But previously, myself and a group of people were considering just buying some land and then subdividing it and having a community informally. That is certainly an option. The downside is once you subdivide it, anyone can sell off their lot and anyone can move in, and you don't really have any say over that. So it can
Hmm.
start as one kind of community with one intention, and then it's just out of your hands. And people typically don't stay in one place for their entire life. People do tend to move once in a while. So um, Peter Siri is our secretary, and he had done the research into this kind of dual organization structure, private membership association to allow for exclusivity, and then an LLC owning the actual property itself so that we can manage the land, distribute ownership rights without having tenancy in common, which is the other way to jointly hold land. With a tenancy in common arrangement, if someone backs out or feels injured in some way from the arrangement, they can force a partition of the entire land. So people often do this for like hunting clubs and things like that. They'll have a tenancy in common with 12 people, owning a few hundred acres. And if at any point any one of them decides to, you know, claim some kind of grievance, they can actually break up the whole arrangement. And we didn't want that risk, which is why it's a company that owns the land. So those are basically the two options. Actually, there are three: it's a trust, a corporation, or a tenancy in common. A
Hmm.
trust is actually a very good idea, but it's very expensive to set up. Like if you have an attorney who's experienced with trusts in your back pocket somehow, then great, pursue that. And we probably will move to using trusts in the future. There are some real like tax advantages and things like that. But an LLC is super easy to set up. A PMA is very easy to set up, and we do want to facilitate people, finding this arrangement because given the Fair Housing Act, given other laws that restrict the buying and selling of real estate and what you can develop and what you can't. We want to make it easy to get around those hurdles. And there are only so many ways. We found kind of the one straight and narrow, easy path. um, so, yeah, we want to popularize that. So, no, it wasn't exactly just myself that established Return to the Land. We were also, all fans of Asha Logos, who had put out a video called "Return," a call to return to the land. So, uh, multiple people were thinking about this sort of thing. There were multiple attempts to actually get a land buy together. What we landed on was definitely a process of consensus building and different perspectives having an input.
That makes sense. So with the start of it, you had gone and gotten all of these people together. Was there kind of a previous legal, so did you have to discover these legal systems as you were building it? Did someone previously know about the different options? How has that worked?
Mhm. Well, I had done some research on some limited options for holding land in common. I had considered tenancy in common. I had considered simply subdividing. I was in favor at that point in time when we started the process of just subdividing land. But Peter Siri had done the research into private associations and having a corporation hold the land. And it's turned out to work really well. It allows us to have a kind of governance structure. Because another thing with communities is not just the difficulty of buying the land and keeping the community of a certain kind of ethnic character, but it's also, you know, managing expectations and communication and having community guidelines. And um, a corporate structure allows for bylaws that can be very specific. And we can
Mhm.
amend those bylaws over time. So it's basically like having our own town, having our own town council, and having a governance process for, improving quality of life. Gradually, we are, improving little things here and there.
That makes sense. I had listened to some of Peter's videos talking about it as well, actually. And I was one other curious thought I had was, so for a lot of this, is this something like, I guess, were you looking to someone who had built something like this, or has this been, especially from the legal perspective with setting up the corporation? Because I heard him talking recently a little bit about setting up a legal fund in case of potential future, problems. It's not like to a lot of people, I don't know, like that it might seem problematic, people who don't have like a similar worldview, I guess. And so I don't know what potential issues would arise, but I guess from setting it forward, has a lot of this legal research been novel to you guys? Was there someone you had to look at? I'm curious how you've gone with that.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it has not really been tested. Similar organizations haven't exactly existed in the US. There have been other groups wanting to do similar things, but none have used the exact structure that we're using now.
Mhm.
So it's one of those things where, in principle, what we're doing is legal. You know, we haven't been sued yet. No one doing what we've been doing has been sued, so it just hasn't come before a judge. There's no
Mhm.
case law on this specific kind of thing, which is why building up that legal defense fund and doing further research is basically preemptively getting ready to establish that case law if we're ever taken to court. And there are many reasons why someone might sue us for discrimination or some unrelated thing um, about real estate development that we weren't aware of, which is why we're trying to look in all of the different directions, not just on the real estate development side and what's legal, what's not legal, but also corporate law, securities law, and discrimination laws. There are many different legal specialties that all come together in this particular kind of arrangement. So we do have to, yeah, do that novel research for our own kind of situation.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's one of the reasons I've found what you guys are doing so interesting as well, is because it does seem like you are thinking ahead a lot and really preparing for, when you hear stories about people doing things not similar or just anything like this, it always some idiot tries to come along to ruin it, and it feels like a lot of times people aren't ready. And so that's one of the reasons I found you guys really impressive, is that I think that it seems like it's been very systematic in how you've been set up. It seems like you've really thought ahead, and that's something that I found to be really interesting. Do you, with the way the community is set up, is it more so, did you guys like find a town that you thought you would work well with and kind of maybe like plug in outside of it? Is it more of a homesteading? Are you farming? I'm curious, what does that look like as far as how you're building the community?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The main, I guess, criteria for where we were looking was based on where Peter had done research and I had done research. Both of us liked the Ozarks. Also, Scott, one of the big early, investors and members and founding parties involved. He was already in southern Missouri. I was in southern Missouri. Peter was just moving back up. Actually, Peter Siri had a community already in South America.
Hmm.
Um, Not based on ethnicity or anything like that. It was about like eating fruit exclusively, fruitarianism.
Yeah,
So
fruitarian.
that was his thing. Not anymore. So he eats meat, but he was moving back up to the U.S. and he had kind of identified the Ozarks. A lot of preppers identify the Ozarks as an ideal kind of situation. Homesteaders as well, just people looking to get away from too much government oversight and regulation. So there are very limited building codes. The only building codes that apply exactly where we are the national ones, and there's no enforcement body that will come out and say this is to code, this isn't to code. And you can it has its pros and cons. It's not like New England where every municipality has really strict guidelines, and as a result, building standards are very high, and it's like these nice neat little towns. Down here, it's just whatever you can afford, whatever you can throw together, and it does show. So as long as we personally set ourselves to high standards, that's good. As uh, like on the part of the broader culture, it's made me realize like, well, maybe like having strict building codes isn't the worst thing, and maybe we can apply our own. It's just more pragmatically speaking, though, having building codes that are enforced just gives the law more angles to attack you if they don't like what you're doing for other reasons. So they
Hmm.
might not give you a permit. If there are codes in your city or exactly where you are, then if the town government is against you because they heard of what you're trying to do and you have a bad reputation with them, then they could absolutely shut you down by just not letting you continue to build. So, having no codes, no permitting required, no zoning code that we have to abide by, it just gives the government fewer ways to attack us if they chose to. Of course, we don't want to make ourselves enemies of the government, but you have to recognize that's a possibility, especially if activists, hear what we're doing and want to make things difficult for us. So that's one of the main reasons for the Ozarks. Arkansas over Missouri, we were looking in both places, and we ended up siding on the side of Arkansas, partly because of the septic laws. It's a little bit easier to install septic systems here on a certain sized piece of land. You don't have to get your system permitted. So once again, it's just lower permitting requirements means fewer opportunities for some governing agency to stop what we're doing. So that's kind of why we're in Arkansas ultimately. The town itself, I mean, we looked at a bunch of different properties, and this one stood out. It was more about the merits of the land. Intrinsically, there are a lot of really high quality rivers in the area. We're pretty close to Spring River, which is it's fed from Mammoth Spring, which is the seventh largest spring in the world, actually. So it's really high quality, like cold even in the middle of the summer. Um, Very nice water source, and most of us do have some kind of inclination towards you know preparedness as well as identitarianism. So being in a place that's like naturally self-sustaining is a big plus. The soil quality isn't great. That would be ideal if we could also find a place that wasn't as rocky and as much clay content as here in the Ozarks. But as a result of that lower soil quality, the land prices were a lot lower. When we bought our 150 acres, it was at 1,500 per acre, which is, I mean, go ahead and try to find land at 1,500 an acre now. It'd be very difficult.
Hmm.
So yeah, a variety of factors. We did like the town itself, but primarily it was just the region, how people are down here combined with the law and then the climate.
That makes sense. When it comes to, I guess, the continued, like creation of income and stuff, are a lot of the people mainly working in the area? Are they doing like homesteading type stuff, like self-sufficient? Are they trying to start businesses? I'm curious how that works, because I would imagine that you largely, from a cultural perspective, are trying to build something specific within the community as far as a lot of the interactions people are getting. I mean, I could be wrong, but as far as, to at a certain extent, especially when you're starting, I'd imagine doing jobs outside and, around the town and stuff like that might be necessary.
Hmm. Yeah, I have a job nearby. Other members also have gotten jobs nearby. We have a policy that we actually are emulating Orania in. The own work policy is what they call it. Um, so we try to hire our own guys for any construction work. And because we're developing raw land from scratch, there are a lot of construction tasks that have to be done. So there's kind of different classes of people economically that get involved. There are people who have resources that want to homestead with their family, and they don't have to worry about an income source. They have a business already somewhere else, or some other way of supporting themselves. And then there are people who are trying to move here, and they're professionals, they're remote workers, or they can get some kind of high paid job in the area just based on their resume. And then there are people who aren't as well established, and that's the kind of person that would probably benefit from taking those construction jobs, building up trade skills. Um, and we've had several young guys come down, some who camped for a period of time, some who ended up buying lots, um, or buying shares, I should say, in the community. And so, yeah, it's kind of a combination of tasks. We try to keep the work in house to provide jobs for younger guys. There are some remote workers, there are some people who get jobs nearby. And yes, definitely, there are several of us who are trying to garden for ourselves, raise animals for ourselves. That's one of the reasons we set a minimum lot size at 3 acres. So it would keep a rural feel, keep like a self sufficient feel. So all of us can do agricultural operations. There's definitely enough space to do that on a 3 acre lot.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. How did your thought process, I wonder, like, were there any big insights you gained after visiting Irania and coming back? Were there any, I'm curious how that worked, because I mean, they're probably one of the best examples of I mean, in the world, I would imagine, of of an explicit community built for one type of person, or for their own people, and especially in what would seem to me from the outside to be a very harsh general climate towards them.
Right. Yeah. Well, part of what allows them to remain as insulated against the general culture as they are is that they're in the middle of the desert. So you have to drive a long way to get to Orania, and there's really nothing surrounding them. It's just desert, and then there's Orania in the middle of the desert. And they also have a very nice river nearby, or actually, it's cutting through their land, so they get water from the river. It really keeps the whole community going, um, and it's impressive, certainly, what they've done with just land in the desert. I mean, they've really turned it green. Development has and is still like moving at a very breakneck pace. Housing values are extremely high. I mean, in general, housing in South Africa is much, much cheaper than in America. But in Orania, I mean, it's pretty much comparable to housing values here in the Ozarks, and average incomes are 10 times lower than what they are here. You
Hmm.
know, so um, so certainly there is demand for what they're doing. As far as like what I took away from the experience, one of the big concepts was the importance of a development company, and the way their development company operated, I think, is very smart. So the company will put in water, electric, and sewer, and then sell off lots and allow people to develop those lots. And I believe they will help with financing lots and in some situations. There's also their own bank that they started. So those two institutions, their development company and their bank, I realized like we definitely have to have something that performs these two functions. We will probably end up having one company that does both. So this isn't something that's finalized yet, but we are well on the way towards building this development company where it will. So there'll be investors. We'll have to register with the SEC, and uh, so the company will buy shares in our communities, put in basic infrastructure or make improvements to existing infrastructure. In some cases, just buy it and finance it to, families or individuals who want to move down and can't afford all of it up front. And that's been one big limiting factor to growth, is that we've made it very affordable to own land. Like you can right now get 3 acres that are cleared, and the clearing, dozing, that's very expensive. So 3 cleared acres for, less than 15, which also, yeah, it's kind of hard to find today. But not many people have $15,000 in the bank, unfortunately. For some people that's nothing, and they have far more than that. But the average American, I believe, has less than $5,000 in their savings account.
Mhm.
That's to their name. That's what they have. And a large number of people are simply living paycheck to paycheck. So we do want to make it easier. When people buy homes, the vast majority of the time they finance it. Even if they have the money to buy the home outright, most people choose to finance because, you know, people don't have hundreds of thousands of dollars just sitting around that they don't have other ideas of what they want to do with it. So, so yeah, development company, some kind of financial institution. Like I said, we'll probably merge those functions. Um, the trade school, I think, is a really good idea. We would like to have something like that, but it'll be probably more of a men's, you know, initiation process as well as a trade school. So it'll be inculcation into the Western tradition, philosophically, historically, learning things that are relevant to our perspective ideologically as well. So like, why are we doing this community? What's the rationale? Why identitarianism? What's the ethical justification of that? So basically a course in, how we've got here, why we're doing this, and then on top of that, picking up trade skills. And you know, young guys like that could easily do work in the community. So the trades school in Irania, those students will often go on to do work for the people of Irania. And yeah, we're not there yet. We need to build the infrastructure to house a school like that, but I think that will be a very good addition as well. So I think, and actually, we weren't aware of it at the time, but Irania operates in a very similar way, where the Irania company owns all of the land there, and individuals buy shares in the company, which then confers them access and rights to their particular lot. So they don't buy the lots and have a deed to the lots; they buy shares in the company. And so it's on many points. I think we're going to end up aligning with what Irania has done, just because in all different Western nations, the law, there are differences, but given the state of Western law in general, there is only really one clear cut path to build communities like this. And they found it 30 years ago. We're just coming to the table, but I think more and more people around the world will start forming communities that are modeled more or less in the same way.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes sense. That kind of bridges naturally. I had seen you do videos. I know you've made multiple of them. I've maybe watched one or two talking about for a certain period of time. Obviously, you do philosophical education online through the reading groups, and you're well known for like debating people, talking with people, stuff like that. I had seen you were trying to do a philosophical school for a period of time. So, does your experience with that kind of how does that I guess influence your ideas with the school and with that kind of stuff moving forward? What level of philosophical buy-in does the average person in the community have? I'd imagine from a baseline kind of human instinct level, it's pretty easy for people to understand if they're not like bought into liberalism and that kind of thought process, right? But I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, the community members in general are far more philosophically inclined than the general public, but not as invested in academic philosophy or like, ancient philosophy as myself. I was running a philosophy group weekly. Since then, and this is kind of known publicly, I had to buy a house nearby while I developed my lot because I have 4 kids and it's just necessary that they have all of their bases met, running water and everything they're supposed to have. So I got a little overexcited at first and wanted to immediately live on the land, but that it wasn't the best idea, and so now I have a house 15 minutes away while I'm working to get that my lot there on the land ready to go. So anyway, once I had to buy this house and I'm working closer to here, so the goal is to be back on the land full time. When I am, I'll probably run that philosophy class weekly again. It's kind of on a hiatus. I would like to get back to it, but anyway, we did that for a while, and that was pretty rewarding. As far as the full Platonic Academy experience that I was initially going for, I don't know if that's going to be realized anytime soon. I think for the purposes of the community, a trade school / Western Civ primer would be a lot more appropriate and more valuable to the kinds of guys who would be willing to come out to the Ozarks. Um, I'd love it if there were more people who were more philosophically inclined in our circles. When I was going to go for just a straight Platonic academy, it wasn't going to be like a European heritage institution. It was just going to be a Platonic academy. That was it. And I had talked about uh, intentional community on the basis of identitarianism in the past, but that wasn't happening. So in the meantime, I kind of shifted my orientation towards this philosophy school because I thought that would also be very valuable and ultimately good for the greater good, whether it helped my people directly exclusively or not. I think it would help them, and it would help the world as well, because it just should exist. For hundreds of years in antiquity there was a Platonic academy, and it's a shame that we don't simply have that same thing. Platonism, there are thousands of Platonists around the world who are doing their own work in their own fields, but there's no like Platonic institution for integrating all of these studies. And I think the how far we could go with an institution like that is unlimited. For how compatible it is with our community, that's not totally clear.
Mhm.
So anyway, I think the 1.0 version will be something more like trade school, Western Civ primer, some philosophy. I would really love, like I said, like I wish people cared more about philosophy. I wish they understood like how foundational it is. And to me, it's always been really clear that everything else is in fact built up from that. Like whatever kind of science you're in, that science was laid down and the limits of it were established by a philosophical process. All the sciences come from philosophy. All of our ethics, yes, there were religious ethics as well from revelation, but even then, like they don't typically religious institutions don't leave it at that. They don't leave it as at, oh, well, the Bible says this or our sacred text says this. They also have philosophical justifications, even in the religious world. So it's like in every dimension of life that matters, our progress in terms of knowledge, our progress morally, our progress in political theory, it's all philosophy. But a few years ago, people in our circles were more philosophically invested than they are today. And I don't know how to give those protreptic arguments, give the case for why philosophy is necessary. I've done it in the past, and people were more receptive. It just feels like, in general, people are becoming more and more like instant gratification and superficial in their thinking. They're just kind of, it's too much brain rot, I think, and they want everything to be right there, something they can engage with. in a multimedia experience. And I don't know, it's a big struggle. My heart is still kind of primarily with the philosophy. I'm working on the community. I also care very deeply about that, but I'm primarily, giving my attention to that because that's where, you make hay while the sun shines. You do the work that you can actually do. I
Mhm.
can't build a Platonic Academy apparently, but here's something people are willing to invest in: wholesome, homogenous, traditional communities, and so that's what I've given my effort to.
To the guy or the family who meets the requirements to be a part of your community, but maybe doesn't necessarily see why they would want to join. I'm curious what are kind of some of the things you might tell them.
Yeah, I mean, I would say individually, it is rewarding to be around people who share your values. It's just a reality that people are more disconnected from their local communities than they used to be. You may have a strong community, I don't know, at your gym. You might have friends. You may have grown up where you are, in which case, you don't feel that lack. But the problem with trusting in the kind of background culture is that it is rapidly changing. The demographics are transforming the nature of the country, and we don't have any control in the general just background culture of the US, or especially the real estate environment of the US. Like, where you're living could be totally transformed basically overnight. A big corporation can put up an operation in your town and then bring in workers. It's totally legal for them to do that. Nothing can stop them from doing that. So, regardless of how safe and comfortable you feel in your hometown, you know, the reality is that over the next, 30 years, whites will become a minority. And if you identify with that people and tradition and heritage and values, what you're comfortable with, what you're familiar with, that is very likely to change. Now, you might get really lucky and exactly where you are will just stay the same, and then everything around you will change. But America as a whole is changing. And so, if we don't build these communities that are structured so as to allow us to maintain our own way of life as we've known it, then it won't exist. Someone has to intentionally build these communities. You may escape the negative consequences of diversity individually in your own life. If you're affluent and you can live in a nice neighborhood, you don't feel it. But even if you're in a nice neighborhood, that too, it's not going to have your own individual heritage associated with it in perpetuity as things are currently going. It may remain an affluent community. It may remain a safe community, but it's probably not going to remain a white community. And it's not just obviously about skin color, it's about your people and your civilization and your heritage. If you care about that heritage and you want that way of life, which is all encompassing, to be maintained, you're going to have to build places, fortresses, safe havens where it can be maintained. And we don't want it to be a small thing. We want many hundreds, eventually thousands of these communities to exist so that, those pushing against traditional white American culture and the white American people, they will not be able to push us out. They won't be able to replace us. And you saw I'm sure you've seen the UN documents about replacement migration. It's like it's an explicit agenda to replace the native people in Europe and in North America. And, by native people, I mean the people who founded this country. Sure, there were natives to the land before us, but we are the Native Americans. We founded the American nation. That's us. And there are people in this world who want to replace us with, I don't know, a population that's less rooted, a population that may be more compliant. Americans have there's a stereotype about not necessarily being the most agreeable people. We're very individualistic, very, pioneering, very entrepreneurial, and hard to control. We kicked off this string of revolutions that permanently changed the political landscape of the earth, right? We were the first one. Not that I'm a big supporter of democracy, but it just speaks to the psychological type that we are, and there's a lot of potential in that type. And if
Mhm.
you're someone who wants top-down social control, well, then we're problematic. That's just the reality. Um, so yeah, I mean, why join a community like this if that means sacrificing your quality of life temporarily? Well, because if you don't, then your children will not have communities where they can maintain the kind of lifestyle that your parents and grandparents and great grandparents going back hundreds and thousands of years what they knew. So our people are a global minority, and that minority is shrinking. And there are people who want us gone. They talk about it,
Yeah. Mhm.
so that's why, like,
Mhm.
but also, like, it can be a very rewarding thing individually. Like, we just um acquired some land on the river nearby so that we can have private river access, and we can have, get-togethers, and we might operate a camp out of there, and we have events twice a year where we, have games and have lectures, and there's just a lot more that you can do with a community of people who are like-minded, who want a common destiny, than you can by yourself. And maybe you have friends at your gym, and you have friends, that you've known from growing up. But typically, as you get older and people get more invested in their own families, those friendships just weaken. Maybe you'll still see your friends, but is that the kind of foundation for a community that's going to last through generations? Or is that you just kind of getting the last bit of social capital that you can out of a dying social arrangement? Like, you're lucky enough to have that, but will your kids have the same luxury? Will your grandkids have the same luxury? Probably not. So it's rewarding to be around like-minded people. There's more potential for projects. We have incentives to start businesses together. We have incentives to come up with new solutions, and we're constantly brainstorming new solutions and new ways forward. It just makes life more interesting. And yes, there will be a sacrifice in terms of quality of life if you're used to all the amenities of living in a city or a suburb. We will eventually get to the point where it's comfortable and easy. But if you want to be part of the pioneering group that is paving the way for a new way of life, well, then that not only comes with costs, it also comes with inherent psychological benefits. You feel more, it feels more rewarding to do something that's difficult. When you build a homestead from scratch and you look at it, and this was raw land before I got here, and now, here's my garden, and here's my white picket fence, and here's, a nice looking house. Um, it- but that, not just on an individual scale, but also the whole community. Like, when we got here, it was raw land, and now look at it. You see every day, every week, every passing year, you see that progress. And for most people, that's not how life is. It's like the same thing day to day, week after week. It's just more of going to work, coming home, going to work, and maybe you move, but you don't see that development. You don't see that opening up of new possibilities as time goes on. You don't see constant recruitment and new people coming in who are all like-minded. It's just a very exciting, rewarding way to live. Um, but yeah, it'll be outside of many people's comfort zone. But hey, comfort doesn't make you great. Comfort doesn't make you strong. It doesn't make you virtuous.
Another thing that I've heard you say, and I would be interested in hearing you elaborate, you had done a space with like Groypers a while back, and you were kind of critiquing a little bit of Nick Fuentes's his preferred solution, I guess, to the problem. And
Mhm.
from as far as I can tell, their solution seems to be elites are the people who make the changes. So all we need to focus on is finding the elites and basically convincing them of our ideas. I don't know if that's I'm not trying not to straw man. But I'm trying to, as a simplified kind of explanation. And you had kind of spoken against that. I'm curious if you could maybe examine that kind of obviously your solution is different than that. Maybe why you think there's problems with that, because that's something or a sentiment I've heard a lot from people, especially kind of on the dissident right side. Elites are the only people who matter. Elites are the only people who make change. I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, well, elites are produced from the body of the people, right? They go beyond the average person and they do a lot more than the average person. But the elites that you get are a product of how the people on average are, right? The bell curve is written or drawn around the average, right? That's the center. That's
Mm-hmm.
what's actually defining what's going to happen on the extremes. So yes, I mean, you have to recognize the significance of elites, but also you have to recognize they're not freestanding. Jews obviously have a lot of elites, but they're not all elites. Jews are successful because they have all levels of society, of their own society, working together. They get accused of nepotism, and I don't think there's anything really wrong with preferring your own people. If they hire a Jewish mechanic when they can, okay, fine. We should be doing the same thing. We should hire our own people rather than foreign people. Other groups do it, but they subsidize their average people. Bar mitzvahs. That very often, like a young man will receive thousands and thousands of dollars that then he has to take his time with his education and get a good foundation in life. And whereas many Gentiles, we have no support whatsoever. We're just thrown out there. And if we go to college, it's all on loans that then we have this huge financial pressure to pay back the loans. And, because we're not looking out for our own people. Our elites don't transfer the wealth down to our average people, whereas that demonstrably actually does take place in the Jewish community. And Jews also, they pay in collectively. All members of Jewish society tend to pay in to Jewish causes. Just like Catholics tithe for the sake of, their religious efforts and charity. Well, Jews contribute to Jewish political causes, and that allows them this extraordinary lobbying power, right? They're able to lobby Congress and influence government because they're all contributing. That's not just Jewish elites. You need the elites in there representing the interests of the common people. But the idea that elites are all that matter is just, it's not in keeping with the empirical evidence of successful elites who actually do shape our culture. And that's, it should be really obvious that elites need to come from some average. There's a regression to the mean. When you have a really high IQ, exceptional person, their offspring are probably not going to be quite as exceptional, right? You can't just maintain every generation is going to be at 160. The kids probably will, move closer to that average. And gradually another elite family will rise up from sometimes humble origins. It does happen. Where do you think elites come from? It's not some totally separate bloodline that moves in parallel with the rest of us, and they're the ones who do everything and we do nothing. It's like, no, these populations are connected, and they've become less connected. But that mentality is exactly why our people as a whole is being replaced in our homelands, because those elites saw themselves as exempt from the consequences of what happens to the average person. They stopped caring about looking after us. Now, people who are identitarians, who supposedly care about our whole collectives, they're occupied by this same kind of idea that elites are all that matter, and we should only think about them. But that's exactly what got us in this situation. So you have to have respect for the average person, and it's also clearly like the fundamental Christian teaching, against worldly occupation, against obsession with wealth, forgiving people, respecting people who have humility, revering humility, and the poor in spirit, and all of that. So like if you are a Christian, you cannot be this kind of elite theorist only, um, political thinker, because politics isn't separate from society. And Jesus also said the poor shall inherit the earth, the meek shall inherit the earth. So that's not an elite theorist perspective. So even
Yeah.
politically speaking, like Jesus is refuting you right there with that one verse. So I mean, I do think that we should cultivate elites and celebrate elites that come out of our people, but we should, you know, view that they have a noblesse oblige to cultivate the average, um, European person, so that that average is lifted up and elevated.
Mhm.
You can't only improve the elite. Maybe with transhumanism now you will get that. Just the elites will move up and up as they have the wealth to invest in gene editing and all the other things they're going to try. So maybe that'll manifest. But conventionally speaking, you can't just improve the elite stock ad infinitum, but you
Yeah.
can gradually improve the average person by setting standards in society. And yes, improving education does have an impact on people's ability to perform, but also by investing in education and setting the right values and investing in social capital, you set better selective pressures. If you have a low class, low investment, kind of culture, then the people who have kids in that culture will be the people who thrive in that kind of disorganized, R selective environment. And that's a certain kind of person. Whereas if you invest in education, subsidize education for average people, give people the opportunity to use their intellect, and don't force them into just a merely servile position, give everyone the opportunity to raise up. Well, then the selective pressure, the thing that will be perceived as valuable in the sexual marketplace, will be a higher intellectual and moral caliber. So if you put that investment back into the people, it raises up that average, and then that raises up the quality of the elite. And also then the elite can maintain themselves because their foundation is stable.
Mhm.
And yeah, to think that like we don't have a responsibility for building that base, we just have to focus on the elites, like that itself is parasitical. Elites come from the base. If you want the elites, then you should invest in the base, invest in all of it, but don't just, scrape the cream off the top and say that's all that matters and neglect the cow, because then the cow will die and you won't have any cream, you know?
Mhm. Yeah, I agree. That image you used kind of shows, I guess, how short-sighted it is. Um, I think it's kind of a that's another thing with that group I have a bit of a difficulty with is it seems like maybe it might just be a preference that I think things are going to take longer and they don't, and maybe that forces me to okay, what's a longer term solution? And if they think there's a short term solution, they might not feel the need to think like that. But yeah, that is interesting. That was something that I've had difficulty agreeing with a lot of them on, and I think that makes them a bit difficult to interact with sometimes. At least the people in that thought group, not all Fuentes supporters, and I'm sure even him as a person is not necessarily exclusively thinking like that. Although it does come through a lot in the way he talks.
Yeah, no, I think he definitely has a bias towards it. He has talked about, we need our own institutions. he came pretty close to basically advocating for intentional communities, but because of his temperament as just being, he is inherently elitist. He would want communities that immediately have all of the amenities and prestige of living in a big city, and that's not realistically where you're going to start. So unless you can humble yourself first, you're not going to be able to build that, you know, uh, resilient parallel to the mainstream.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious if you would be, I think that's a lot of the stuff. I don't know if there's anything else you want to leave on the community specifically. I was curious about asking you some of your broader thoughts on politics, and not like philosophy explicitly, but I guess they're pretty much inextricably linked. So maybe some other questions. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to leave off with the community.
No, I would just mention, you can apply at returntotheland.org. We are trying to found communities all over the country, but there is one actually existing community now. I encourage people to come down and visit, consider visiting for an event. We have a big event in October for members only. And actually, this October event is going to be especially large. There'll be some guest speakers that you've definitely heard of. Um, so that'll be an exciting time. But like I said, returntotheland.org. You fill out a questionnaire and then schedule an interview. And then once you're in, you're free to come down and visit whenever. So,
Okay, awesome. Sounds good. Thank you. Um, one of the things that like I said, I've only started reading philosophy very recently, and I'm curious specifically for you, why do you have the loyalty you do, I guess, to Platonic ideas? What kind of started that for you? And I'm curious how that's influenced you. What kind of got you there? I've heard you talk a little bit about your life. One of my favorite videos, I was telling the story to my fiance, was you were talking about how you were in the orchestra or the band for the Falun Gong
mhm.
Shen Yun shows. And I thought that was such a funny story. I was telling her about that. But I'm curious in general how you kind of arrived at your point. I know you used to be Catholic. I'm curious kind of what is your story of your philosophical development.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Platonic ideas specifically, I kind of converged with. For other independent reasons, agreed with the basic logic behind universals, Platonic realism, particularly in math. One of the big thinkers that I was into before really giving Plato himself the credit he was due was Max Tegmark, modern physicist. Um, I don't know if you're familiar with his arguments, but they made a lot of sense to me, and they do mirror very closely Platonic arguments, where essentially, like, all that we know about physical systems in the strictest, most rigorous possible sense is expressible in terms of mathematical equations, in terms of numbers, so information, mathematical structure. Now, there's nothing at a physical level beyond the mathematical structure that we can add in language to give more precise, rigorous meaning to like the nature of physical reality. So essentially, like the math is exhaustive of what we truly know about the world. And if that's the case, then why believe that the math is some separate thing, a language that just so happens to perfectly isometrically map onto physical reality at every point? Why make that additional assumption? And why not just say, no, the underlying nature of the physical world is mathematical? When we're doing math conceptually, intellectually, it's not some separate realm. It is the same kind of activity that's going on at a physical level as well. And there are many modern physicists who they wouldn't necessarily go with Max Tegmark's mathematical universe hypothesis that like physical reality simply is math per se, but they would go with an information reductionalism. That's a mainstream view. In loop quantum gravity, space time is emergent from underlying information. I think the majority of physicists today believe that space-time is an emergent phenomenon, and more fundamental than that is this kind of informational level of existence.
Mhm.
Um, so, yeah, information reductionism, the mathematical universe hypothesis, it's a sort of contemporary Pythagorean renaissance. And I was always following contemporary physics concepts. I was interested in that as a kid. I was raised very lax Catholic, no strong commitments to the church on the part of my family, that we would go sometimes, sometimes not. I was curious about the questions that religion addresses, and so I went and wanted to find out more. There was one episode where actually I was the one who requested that my family started going to church. They were totally lapsed, and I wanted to go so that I could at least maybe talk to the priest, ask questions about God and so forth. And the priest just totally shot me down, saying like, "Oh, you can't know about God. You can't know God. Just like accept the mystery. That's it." And I understand like where that's coming from now, but there's a lot of questions that you actually can address. There's a lot of curiosity that you don't have to just completely stifle. And I don't think that was a one-off situation with just that priest. I think there is something about organized religion that does work against philosophical inquiry. And some people are philosophical thinkers, and you're not going to totally squash that in them, so they'll continue questioning. Now, at the higher levels, yeah, like Catholicism is open to philosophy, but at a certain point, there is this tension and has been historically between, philosophy and faith, reason and faith. So anyway, I was like alive to that tension as a child and leaned against religion partly because of that, partly because it felt like I have questions that you're saying I cannot have addressed. And I have arguments that like seem compelling to me that I'm coming up with on my own part that like you're just not willing to address. Religion seemed very opaque and not open to those questions or dialogue. Certainly not a like good faith dialogue. Well, here, let me hear you out. Maybe you're right. There was absolutely no possibility that I could be right. It was like you have to accept the dogma and that's it. And I didn't take well to that. So I leaned towards atheism at a certain point in time. When I was 12 or 13, like many 13-year-olds, I was an atheist, and then I leaned back towards religion and back and forth in my teen years, and then did become like a true believing Catholic for a brief period of time at the end of high school. And then when I went to college, I just kind of kept finding deeper arguments on both sides. And sometimes the argument would put me back towards Christianity. Sometimes it would push me back towards atheism. And then over the course of my years in college, I went from being an atheist to being, and I was like a loose kind of atheist, not a militant atheist, um, but I was like materialist. And then I started being more interested in idealism because of the physics arguments, and more interested in a kind of perennialism, seeing that all of these different mythological systems are communicating some kind of deep structure of reality. Humans, they naturally want to understand things, and these stories that they tell about, the birth of the gods, or, the subject matter of myth, it's not just empty. And there's a lot of convergence. So if you have billions of people over thousands and thousands of years tapping into these deep questions, like that collective human wisdom shouldn't be simply ignored. So I started paying attention to comparative mythology, reading people like Joseph Campbell, and then getting interested in Hinduism as one aspect of comparative mythology. And I found that there was very, very deep philosophical content in Hinduism. And I started, attending the Advaita Vedanta Center in Hollywood for a period of time. And I found that all of those questions that I wanted to address to my priest, they would actually entertain me. They would actually hear me out and address them. And typically they had very compelling arguments, and they changed my mind on a number of points. Um, so, so that was one turning point. And then I started, recognizing the similarities between Hinduism and Platonism. and reading Plato again a little bit. I read like towards the end of college some of the dialogues and enjoyed them a lot, but I didn't really get like the underlying deep philosophy. I enjoyed like the surface level heuristics or the combative exchanges between Socrates and Gorgias or whatever character. Um, so so yeah, I started seeing those parallels, and then I kind of came back to Christianity by understanding that Christianity does encode this same essential perennial philosophy. I read a book by not Aldous Huxley. Well, I read Huxley's Perennial Philosophy, but I read Alan Watts's. Um, I forget what his book on Christianity is called now, but he has a book on Christianity interpreted in a kind of perennialist way, and specifically looking at Catholicism in that way. And so that was a compelling book. And then I started thinking about like the Hindu idea of the avatar, and the lot like interpreted historically, we ought to expect God to present himself in a way that's very accessible. And Hinduism isn't accessible to everyone. Christianity is. So just prima facie, like that's a stronger historical case that an avatar or an incarnation of God would be a historical figure that is totally ubiquitously known, that's, teaching a profound new moral doctrine also that positively impacts people, and the salvific power of Christ's doctrines, specifically the power of, reciprocal forgiveness, that's just impossible to deny. Like, yes, Europe was civilized and sophisticated in many ways before the advent of Christianity. It's not like Christianity brought civilization to Northern Europe. There was a deep history going back thousands of years of civilization, even in Northern Europe. But they were extremely violent, and that was corrected. So we stopped the millennia of blood feuds. We started being more productive, building up infrastructure. So the historical arguments combined with this like perennialist interpretation just made Christianity a very natural fit. And I started practicing as a Catholic again for years, for a decade, until recently where, and all that time I had this kind of perennialist interpretation, Platonic interpretation. I didn't believe in papal infallibility. I didn't believe even in a traditional interpretation of the Nicene um, Council findings and the creed and all of that. Like, I more or less agree with what you find in the creed, but interpreted in a specific way. I didn't agree with everything in the catechism. Like, I couldn't stop being philosophical, and I couldn't like cede all of that ground to belief in all of these kind of given propositions that weren't fully defended. So yeah, like my interpretation was more open, and then just going to church after all of that time. I kept having to hear these prayers to have us have an open heart and accept refugees, or just the same stuff that they're pushing all over the world to people of European descent. Like, the Catholic Church is funding refugees in Europe, like it or not. They are participating in the displacement of my people. So the value that I got in the ritual aspect and all of that, like, it just, I couldn't tolerate it anymore, essentially. And I no longer really believe that Catholicism is, I know you're a Catholic, so I'm sure you'll take issue with this, but I just don't believe it's what Jesus intended. And I think that I have to be true to what I personally genuinely believe, and continue searching for that authentic Christianity, which I think essentially no one has. And I think we all have pieces of the truth, but like, what the truth that Jesus came to deliver, I don't think we're going to have in its fullness until he comes back. And so anyway, that's kind of my relationship with Christianity and philosophy, and where I currently stand.
A couple questions, I guess maybe if you could explain a little bit of what you meant. So when you were talking, so when you say God, and I'm not super familiar with Hindu thought, so this is why I'm trying to clarify a little bit. Do you mean like the prime mover, like everything that everything is contingent upon? Like, because obviously from certain pagan perspectives, like, or I'm just going to use the language I'm familiar with. Forgive me if I, say something incorrect, but like a lot of what they would say by God might not necessarily be that exact concept. So I'm curious what you mean when you say that.
When I say an incarnation of God, well, I
Well,
mean, their concept, it is distinct
mhm.
from the Christian concept, but I don't think it's as fundamentally different as many Christians would think or assume. But the idea that the foundation of reality, the one in Platonism, uh, God simply in, or God the Father, or actually in Dionysius, Pseudo Dionysius, there is a kind of vague intimation that the Trinity is not absolutely fundamental, that Godhead is unity first, and then in its approach to man or its emanation towards creation, it's a Trinity. People will dispute that, but if you read closely in Dionysius, I think there is an easy way to interpret that out of what he's saying. So anyway, I think that that is there in mystical Christianity as well. This pre-Trinitarian, absolutely unific, like the one in Platonism. So anyway, that's like Brahman, and then immediately upon, emanating into the world, it the source of creation manifests as a Trinity. In Platonism, the rationale is that there has to be an abiding nature, a proceeding nature, and a reverting nature to all things. In Hinduism, you need the preserving aspect, the uh, like destructive aspect, and then the creative aspect. So essentially the same logic, that you need an abiding, a proceeding or creating, and that's Brahma in Hinduism, and then a reverting or destructing aspect, Shiva. So Vishnu, Shiva, and uh, and Brahma, and then Vishnu being the embodiment of the abiding aspect, I guess, is just, for whatever reason, the most appropriate aspect of the Trinity to manifest. And in Christianity, we have God the Father, obviously an abiding aspect. So it doesn't 100% align, but in an abiding aspect there, the Son, a kind of preceding aspect, the Holy Spirit, a reverting aspect. And in this case, the preceding aspect, or maybe there's a way to interpret that Vishnu is more preceding and Brahma is more abiding. I don't know. It's probably not worth getting into the weeds there, because I do interpret all of this stuff analogically and mythically, and I don't think it's not meant to be interpreted as elements in this perfect abstract philosophical system. It's these are signs indicating a deep reality that you can comprehend, not with the intellect, but with a kind of unification of the self with the divine. But I don't think that the names that we're going to put on that level of things will be synonymously attributed. They're going to have to be paronymus, or they're going to have to be named after things analogically, not
Mhm.
just like this is the nature of it. That simply is what it is. No apodeictic, or sorry, no cataphatic predication of Godhead, just like for Thomas Aquinas. You don't cataphatically directly predicate attributes of God. It's always um, either apophatically saying what God is not, or it's analogically, or it's the Hindus and the Platonists all agree with exactly the same approach. And I think that's ultimately kind of the source of where Thomas Aquinas is getting this stuff. He wasn't ignorant of the Neoplatonic corpus. He didn't have all of it by any means, but he was definitely influenced by it, directly and indirectly. But anyway, so God there that incarnates is an aspect of that first manifest Trinity, and that's going to be the highest possible incarnation there can be. I think you would expect there to be a human body present on the earth that most fully aligns with and represents that truth. So that's what I mean by the incarnation of God, and that's what I mean by God. I don't think it's fundamentally different concepts, although there are certainly different layers. Like Platonism and Hinduism break down God into many different layers, whereas traditionally in Catholicism or even Eastern Orthodoxy, you're going to have within God, there's not only the Trinity, but there's also the Logoi, which in Platonism and Hinduism are going to have their own personifications,
Mhm.
right? So in Christianity, it's all wrapped up into God himself. In these other religions, they break it down into more names, but I do think it's ultimately a kind of semantic difference where they're not fundamentally describing like different concepts of divinity or how it operates.
Yeah. I'm actually surprised, at least I think, how well I was able to follow with you. Sometimes I'll watch the videos where you're like lecturing or kind of going. I'll be like, all right, I kind of have to stop and like think for a second, and but yeah, that I I mean, obviously I would disagree with you, and because I'm neither a philosopher or a theologian, would I be able to offer what I view as a legitimate rebuttal, obviously. And so it's like I definitely will say that I am to what seemed to me to initially, like when I had heard some people talk about you, they're like, oh, he's like a Christian Hindu. And when someone says that, it on its face it seems so ridiculous when someone just says, oh, he's a Christian Hindu, and you're like, in what way does that, but when you explain it, obviously I understand kind of what you're saying, more, at least I would like to think so. um I'm curious, when you were interviewing Leather Apron Club, you had asked him a little bit about his religion, and he had said that he hadn't really come to any conclusions, and that he was kind of, I think he had said something like, most of my thoughts on that come from like a politics first perspective. I'm curious in what way, and I thought that was interesting to hear him say, I'm curious in what way your politics directly relate to your philosophical system. Not necessarily like obviously vote for Republican or Democrat, but in a deeper, more real sense.
Yeah, sure. I mean, politically, I am pretty much a Platonist, just like I am metaphysically. So I believe that society should be structured in a way that cultivates an elite, but an authentic elite, not a mercantile elite, a philosophical elite, an aristocracy, because you need philosophy to develop human understanding. It's that integrative function. It's what gives definitions and axioms and principles to all other sciences and systems. So Plato, in the Republic and in the Laws to a lesser extent, outlines training methods that we should have as a fundamental part of society. There are also incidental features of like political Platonism that I happen to align with, like the state should be much smaller than it is. It should be a number of people that you can at least conceptualize. You should probably be able to see the physical territory that the polity actually, or the polis, controls. It has to be a human scaled organization. I think that's like the ideal result at a widespread political level, that we allow for intentional communities to exist and secure that right, and make that, enforce that with the imperial power that America actually has. That's like the good that I think America could in principle do. That's the good that I think liberalism could do. Liberalism as an ideology is obviously too individualistic, but in principle, it allows for every tightly organized collective to coexist peacefully.
Mhm.
So it kind of projects the interstate dynamics onto individuals in a way that like negates the place of culture and the place of the given and the place of tradition, and introduces a cold rationality that has all sorts of knock-on effects that are bad for society. But the place of that liberal order really ought to be between not nation states, but polities that each have very tightly integrated um, social programs that are designed. I'm a Platonist in that sense too, that like it's not just tradition, it's also we are keepers of tradition, and the wisest among us sometimes do supersede the law that we've received from our ancestors. It's like that kind of progress is real, you know, to a point. You can get to a perfect state hypothetically, and then no more progress is necessary, and the goal then should be maintaining that perfect state, increasing our knowledge, increasing our piety and other virtues, and that's probably the kingdom of heaven, right? That's that ideal state, city of God. And then uh, you would probably decline back down. That's how Plato describes it, a historical cycle. But anyway, ideally, we should strive to kind of scientifically understand the basis of law. And yeah, the philosopher should rule, because there's no one else who has that kind of systematic understanding of how every aspect, every art fits together. Like, what art is the art of arts? What science is the science of sciences? According to Aristotle, philosophy, right? The science of sciences, art of arts. And it's that kind of position between everything that's more specialized, that makes it the necessary training or field or occupation for the person who actually rules society. So it's like it's an elitism, but it's also an organicism. It's not the same as fascism. Fascism is not about the eternal archetype. It's about um, shaping reality with uh, an elite that is progressive and futurist in their orientation. Not They're not looking to eternal archetypes. There's nothing in fascism that inherently regards the forms with adequate respect. It's too, I think, modern in its outlook. So I'm not a fascist. Like National Socialism, in some sense, I think there should be a nation that's coherent, and we should look out for the well-being of the nation and have programs to help the average person as well. But I think I'm still more Platonic than that. I think we should cultivate the health of the nation, but especially provide opportunities to ascend, not in the way that the modern American thinks of opportunity as economic opportunity exclusively, or the opportunity to gain power, but opportunity to ascend through a kind of philosophical hierarchy. I mean, the closest institution to that is the Catholic Church.
Mhm.
I will grant Catholicism that. You enter in, you ascend through academic training and piety. It's like what Catholicism does in that regard, where it elevates ultimately, like, the closest thing to a philosopher king that we can um, find in the modern day. And all of the popes are philosophically, just every priest is very educated philosophically. They're not ignorant of the tradition. They've all read Plato. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Um, so, and I think that's one of the reasons that Catholicism is as strong as it is. It continues to keep that philosophical heritage alive in the living understanding of all these priests.
Mhm.
And I wish that Protestantism and other denominations would do the same thing. But I also think we should go beyond. Uh, like, Catholicism is very traditional, and I think Plato, ironically, was not as traditional as he's an ancient thinker, so we associate him with tradition. He's what our tradition was founded on, but Plato was certainly not beholden to the tradition that came before him. He was a revisionist of mythology. He revised interpretations of Homer.
You're saying by
He
the standard of his day, he wouldn't have necessarily been a traditionalist in the
Yeah.
way that you might see a problem with a large amount of Catholics.
Yeah, and what I mean there specifically is that like Catholicism teaches a kind of set canon. Like this is what we're studying um, for our training to become priests. And it's not like we should ignore the canon, but I think that like what we need is more interdisciplinary and more looking for a holistic synthesis that Catholicism, just by its nature as a revealed religion, is not going to be looking for. Where I think we need an institution where people ascend through the ranks, and it's holistic study. It's not just in these areas of philosophy. It's not just this canon of scriptures. It's like all of human knowledge needs to be integrated for us to have that living understanding of how to organize. Plato puts it as we need to intuit the structure, the archetype of the ideal state, connect with the archetype of the cosmos, and that can only be gained by this wide understanding of the nature of reality, empirically acquired, combined with this dialectical ascent, diving into their underlying structural principles. And you need something like that. The modern university system is sort of, it's like aiming at that project, but it's not interdisciplinary enough, and there's not a way to ascend to the top. So I think my political views are very education focused. I think the state structure should be linked to an academic structure, similar to how Catholicism does it. If you could like merge the university system with Catholicism with National Socialism, I think you would get pretty close to like my politics.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, it's when you're describing a lot of the systems and kind of like your ideals, there are a large amount of similarities I see, especially when you're talking about the polity that I see from new forward-thinking Catholic guys who I admire a lot. A lot of them, critiquing, the